Good evening and welcome to tonight's session of Abralim ao Vivo. My name is Vera Cristóvão and I'm today's mediator of Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Modern Foreign Languages and the graduate program of Language Studies at the State University of Londrina, UEL, in Paraná, and a researcher in the area of applied linguistics for the National Council for Scientific and Technological Developments, CNPq. The Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralim, in cooperation with other associations, created this spectacular virtual event, Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online, designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. And today's topic is second language acquisition, SLA. I am pleased and honored to present our speaker tonight, Professor Rod Ellis. Rod Ellis is a distinguished research professor in Curtin University, Australia, a long-standing professor at Anaheim University, visiting professor at Shanghai International Studies University, and emeritus distinguished professor of the University of Auckland. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. He has written extensively on second language acquisition and task-based language teaching. His most recent co-authored book is Task-Based Language Teaching, Theory and Practice, 2020, published by Cambridge University Press. The title of Rod Ellis' talk tonight is A Short History of SLA. Where have we come from and where are we going? I would like to welcome Professor Ellis, whom I thank for having accepted our invitation and for all the contributions to our field. Thank you very much indeed for collaborating for Abralim ao Vivo. And a quick word to our viewers about your participation. Please forward your questions using our chat box. And we also invite you to follow us on Instagram and become a member of Abralim. Professor Ellis.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to my presentation. I notice that it is evening where you are, but I am actually at the moment in Auckland, New Zealand, and it is morning, moving towards lunchtime. I've elected to talk about SLA because I have been involved as a researcher in second language acquisition research for probably 30 years now. And I thought that this was an excellent opportunity to reflect on where we've come from and where we're going. So I'm going to take a historical perspective, and perhaps a historical perspective does not really need any justification, but nevertheless, I'm going to very quickly give one. I start with a quotation from Diane Larson Freeman, who has been involved in second language acquisition research for as long as myself, if not slightly longer. And she said, "It's important to understand ideas at the time they originated." In other words, we need to actually look at the context in which particular ideas first appeared. But I would add something. I would add that it's also important to understand how the ideas that motivated a field of inquiry at one time evolved into and were sometimes, but not always, replaced by later ideas. And that is really what I'm going to try to do in my talk. But I think what I would really like to do to start off with is a little bit of personal history. I think perhaps if I give that, it will give some context to the history of SLA that I'm going to talk about. So here you can see a little bit of biographical information about me. You can see that when I first finished university in the United Kingdom, I took a job teaching English in a Berlitz school in Spain. Didn't stay there very long, went back to London and worked in an elementary school there for a year. I was then offered a job working in Zambia. This was 1967 when I first went there, and it was only 3 years after Zambia had become independent. And I worked in a bush secondary school. In other words, the school that I was working in was 350 kilometers away from any tarmac road. This meant that initially my focus was on teaching. I was trying to develop my skills as a teacher of English, first in Spain and then in Zambia. But I also began to realize that there was a sort of gap between teaching and learning, that very often what one taught was not what learners learned. And I point here to an article that had a lot of influence on me when I went back to study for an MA in linguistics and language teaching at the University of Leeds. That was in 1970. And that article was Newmark, 1966, How Not to Interfere in Language Learning. This is one of the very first articles to suggest that we shouldn't be trying to teach a language. We should be doing what we need to help learners actually acquire a language. In that MA, I took courses on Chomsky and also, interestingly, on Vygotsky. So with that background, I can sort of plot 3 phases in my journey with second language acquisition. I began with what I call the applied phase, which is where I became immersed in the early theories of second language acquisition and sought to apply them to the actual practice of language teaching. And this led to my PhD from the University of London and a book called Classroom Second Language Development, published in 1984. Over time, I moved away from this applied phase into what I call theory and research, SLA for its own sake. In other words, I became interested in how people acquire second language acquisition, what are the factors that influence it, what seems to determine success, etc. And this led to a very voluminous book, over 1,000 pages, called The Study of Second Language Acquisition in 2008. And then in my later years, where I am now really, I moved into a third phase where I started to take as my starting point not SLA, not theory, but rather what seemed to be considered to be good practice in language pedagogy. In other words, I started to look at many of the teacher guides that have been written to try to help teachers to practice teaching. And I used these guides as a sort of resource, and then wanted to check to what extent what was being said in these guides seemed to be compatible or incompatible with what I knew about second language acquisition. And this led to another book, which I wrote with one of my doctoral students, Natsuko Shintani, called Exploring Language Pedagogy Through Second Language Acquisition. And in this book, in each chapter, I started off with what were the pedagogical positions, then looked at the relevant SLA research, and then asked to what extent the two were compatible. So I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that SLA is not one thing. I talk here about the bifurcation of second language acquisition research. Namely, it started out as an applied discipline, because what motivated people to first investigate second language acquisition was not theories of language or theories of mind, but rather what could we find out about how people learn a language that would help us to be better teachers. It was an applied discipline. But it's changed over time, and it's moved away from being a pure applied discipline to become more of a pure discipline. And I think in part this is the result of the pressures of academe, because academe in general tends to give greater value to pure disciplines rather than applied disciplines, etc. Nevertheless, here we are in 2021, and we can still see these two approaches to SLA, the applied and the pure. Okay, all of that was by way of background, a little bit of background about myself, and a little synopsis of what I think has happened in second language acquisition. So now I'm going to start the brief history and try to fill in the details. I'm going to address three principal questions. The first question is, what aspects of second language acquisition has SLA focused on? In other words, what is it actually looked at in investigating second language acquisition? And then the second question is the methodology of second language acquisition. How have researchers set about actually trying to research how learners acquire a language? And then finally, I turn to perhaps what is the underlying issue, which is, why have researchers investigated second language acquisition? So let's begin with the first question: what aspects of SLA have been focused on? And what I'm going to do here is to try to divide up the last sort of 40 odd years, a bit more than that, 50 years of research into second language acquisition into a series of phases, and try to identify what were the main foci of these different phases. For each phase, I'm going to try to identify some of the key people. And on this slide, I'm showing you three photographs of people who were instrumental in getting work on second language acquisition started. I'm not sure whether you know who they are. This one here on the left is Pitt Corder, who worked at the University of Edinburgh. This one is Larry Selinker. I can't remember where Larry was working at this particular time. And this one here is Evelyn Hatch, who spent much of her career working at the University College Los Angeles. These three people were hugely influential in the early days. So what was one of the main findings that emerged from this research? And I think perhaps the major finding was that there was evidence from both longitudinal studies and from cross-sectional studies that there was a relative fixed universal order and sequence of acquisition. I do make a distinction between the word order and sequence. They're not quite the same. And this reflects the kind of research that was done in studies by people like Dulé and Burt. They investigated order cross-sectionally by making an assumption that the accuracy order with which learners were able to perform specific grammatical features corresponded to the order in which they acquired them. In other words, they acquired the ones that they used most frequently before the ones that they acquired less frequently. Sequence, however, was investigated in longitudinal studies by people like Konchino, Rosansky, and Schumann. And what they found was that it's possible to identify stages of development in the acquisition of particular grammatical structures. So at this stage, the grammatical structures that were frequently investigated were negatives and interrogatives. And they were able to show that learners seemed to go through the same set of stages. There were differences according to their L1, but by and large, again, the stages appeared to be largely universal. And the theoretical influences of this stage were L1 acquisition research, which was investigating precisely the same thing, the order and sequence of acquisition of young children, as in Brown and Klima and Belugi's works. That then is the early stage, and that was what really figured in the 1960s and 1970s. So now we're going to move on to a later stage. Sorry, I've jumped forward. I'm trying to move. Just 1 second, get myself organized. I want to clear that. Right, there we go. Once again, I'm going to identify 3 figures that I think were very influential during this particular time. My guess is that many of you can now sort of recognize who these people are. We have Stephen Krashen, who wasn't the first, but built his own ideas around second language acquisition by making a distinction between acquisition and learning. A little bit more on that later. The second one is Michael Long. Michael Long focused very much on the roles of input and interaction in second language acquisition. And the third person is Susan Gass, and she was interested in linguistic universals and how linguistic universals could help to explain why learners seem to follow well-defined paths in the order and sequence of acquisition. I do need to make a brief comment about Mike Long. Some of you may not know, but very recently, last week, in fact, rather sadly, Mike Long passed away. The other 2 people, I'm glad to say, are still thriving. Okay. So this is the expansion period. And once again, what I'm doing here is identifying areas of interest and just giving you a sort of sketch of the key findings in each of these areas. And also, again, mentioning the kind of theoretical influences. So one of the areas of interest that grew in this period, we're now really talking about the 1980s in particular. If you look at all the dates of the studies in the column labeled key studies, you'll see that they're all 1980s. Language transfer, the extent to which the acquisition of a second language was influenced by the acquisition of by knowledge of the first language. Now, this was important because in the earlier stage, the initial early stage, language transfer was to a large extent minimized. This was because the research seemed to suggest that irrespective of learners' language background, you got very similar orders and sequences of acquisition. But in this stage, people began to suggest that in fact, language transfer did have very subtle influences on how people acquired a language. In the very early stage, language transfer was dismissed because it was associated with behaviorism. But in this stage, it got reconceptualized as a cognitive rather than behaviorist phenomenon. The article that I found most influential was Eric Kellerman's 1983 article. And the title of that was, "When Do You See It and When Do You Not See It?" In other words, how can we explain why transfer occurs sometimes, but does not occur at other times? As I've said, Sue Gass was involved in investigating linguistic universals, and also at this time, universal grammar, Chomsky's view of language began to be very influential. And researchers started to test hypotheses that were drawn from linguistics, in particular, the notion of markedness. Markedness was a concept that suggested that there are some linguistic features that are, if you like, more natural, more basic than other linguistic features. And so again, the feeling was, could this help to explain the acquisition of a second language? Also, there were hypotheses drawn from generative grammar, which were tested. The third area of interest during this expansion period was second language pragmatics. The focus here switched to speech acts and started to ask, how do learners acquire the ability to perform requests and apologies? And what are the differences between the way in which second language learners perform such speech acts and native speakers perform them? And this drew on speech act theory and politeness theory. And the fourth area is input and interaction. And you can see three key people here, Krashen, Long, and Swain. Researchers addressed how the linguistic environment influenced second language acquisition. The input hypothesis was Krashen, and Krashen argued that basically learners will acquire a language automatically and naturally as long as they are exposed to comprehensible input. The interaction hypothesis suggested that interaction plays a major role, particularly when communication problems arise and need to be solved. And in the process of solving these, learners' attention gets drawn to linguistic features that are problematic and gives them an opportunity to acquire them. And Swain tried to not replace Krashen, but rather add to it by suggesting that it's not just input that is important for language acquisition, but also output. And she framed what's called the comprehensible output hypothesis. Okay, we're moving on. We're now really into the 2000s. We're into our own century. And again, I want to show you the names of three people. Dick Schmidt, again, sadly, no longer with us, but very influential in the work that he did. Nick Ellis. Nick Ellis is interesting because he is one of the first of the figures that I'm showing to you that came from a different background. His background was not in language teaching at all, but in cognitive psychology. He was a psychologist, in his doctoral research was in psychology, but he was interested in the application of it to such things as reading. And finally, there's Robert de Keyser, who, like Dick Schmidt, like myself, did start off with a background in language teaching and then moved into becoming a researcher of second language acquisition. So you can see we're still in the 1990s, although I think we're also moving into the year 2000. But the key areas of interest were, first of all, the role of consciousness in second language acquisition. How conscious do we have to be about the linguistic forms that we're exposed to in the input in order to be able to learn them? The distinction between implicit and explicit knowledge really began with Krashen, with his distinction between learning and acquisition, but was developed hugely by Nick Ellis's work and his important book published in 1994. And we see here different ways of trying to account for this cognitive aspect of second language acquisition: emergentism and skill learning theory. Emergentism, the idea that there is a natural process of acquisition and that knowledge of specific linguistic forms is not something that occurs in a sudden moment, but rather is a slow, gradual process. And skill learning theory, rather different, which suggested, in fact, that learning starts with explicit knowledge of a particular linguistic feature, and gradually, through practice, this explicit knowledge becomes proceduralized. So skill learning theory makes a distinction between declarative knowledge and automatic knowledge. And you can see the key studies here, and you can see the theoretical influences. SLA was now turning to cognitive psychology, and it was turning to processing models, accounts of implicit, explicit knowledge learning in psychology, and also Anderson's theory, adoptive control of thought, etc. So this really, we can see that whereas initially second language acquisition was heavily influenced by research in first language acquisition, we can see, and then secondly by linguistic theories, now we can see that it's been very heavily influenced by psychological theories. Now we come to the social turn. And it's at this point that a lot of controversy entered second language acquisition. The social turn refers to the fact that researchers began to think that a purely cognitive perspective on how learners learn a second language acquisition was inadequate. That it wasn't just what went on inside the mind of the language learner, it was what the learner, him or herself, did that influenced second language acquisition. The three figures, Jim Lantoff, Meryl Swain. I've already mentioned Meryl Swain with her comprehensible output hypothesis, but she actually made a kind of big switch in her theoretical positioning. She moved away from the cognitive perspective towards the social cultural perspective. And this is Bonnie Norton. So this is the social turn. And the social turn was really announced by a very important article by Firth and Wagner in 1997, where they really wrote an article challenging some of the understandings of second language acquisition. In particular, the idea that second language learning is something that occurred inside the mind of a learner rather than through the social worlds that learners actually participated in. So what these people, Firth and Wagner, Bloch and Norton, started to emphasize is that learners have agency. They're not sort of passive processors of comprehensible input, but they have their own agency and they actively construct their own learning contexts. And in this respect, social identity is crucial. In order to acquire a language, they had to lock into a social identity that gave them access to the language and, if you like, a reason, a motive for actually learning it. They also pointed out another change, because a lot of the earlier research had really focused on interactions between the language learner and native speakers. A lot of the research involved looking at interactions between native speakers and learners. But one of the things that was emphasized in the social turn is that most learners don't learn from interactions with native speakers. Rather, they learn from interactions with other learners. And they pointed out that learners have local agendas. That is to say, their local reasons, their local motivations for wanting to try to learn a second language acquisition. And you can see there the kinds of theories that people were drawing on, socialization theories, such as in particular Lever's community of practice theory, and in general post-structural theories, which emphasized the fact that what happens in language learning is something that is shaped actively by the language learner. Also, but different, with sociocultural SLA. And here, this is where we see Swain again, but also particularly in Lantoff. And they came out with an idea that I think is really quite radically different from the cognitive theories. The cognitive theories, as I've said, emphasize the idea that learning takes place in the mind of the learner. But sociocultural theory said, no, it doesn't. Learning doesn't start off in the mind of the learner. It starts off externally within the interactions that learners participate in. And then gradually, what they are able to do with the help of others in social interaction externally, that gradually becomes internalized, mental, if you like. And sociocultural theory developed a whole set of new constructs: mediation, private speech, zone of proximal development, etc. And the key influence here was, of course, Vygotsky. Now I really have reached where we've got to now, recent developments. And so I offer you three new figures. Two of these were actually involved in second language acquisition right from the beginning, like myself. And the third one, somewhat more recently. This person here is Vivian Cook. And Vivian Cook has also kind of made major changes in his theoretical orientation. He was a kind of Chomsky person in the early days, but in the later days, he's developed a much more general cognitive perspective. This is Diane Larson Freeman, and this is Lourdes Ortega. Here then is a summary of what I see as the recent developments. One key area of interest that is very current at this particular time is what are called complex dynamic systems theory. And you can see some of the names associated with that. one of the aims of this theory was to try to combine social and cognitive perspectives on second language acquisition. It challenged one of the very early findings of second language acquisition, namely the idea that there is a relatively fixed order and sequence of acquisition, and argued that, in fact, learning is very individualistic and, crucially, nonlinear. It does not involve a steady, gradual progression towards the native speaker norms of the language. It also emphasized the interconnectedness of multiple variables, social, cognitive, and psychological individual differences, etc. Interestingly, the theoretical influences of this, again, lay completely outside SLA or language. They originated in mathematics and science, in catastrophe theory and chaos theory, but also very heavily influenced by emergentist theories of language learning. And then finally, we come to the multilingual turn. And this is where Vivian Cook and Lords Ortega have made a substantial contribution. Perhaps the standard idea of bilingualism, becoming a bilingual, is that you develop monolingual competence in two languages separately. But the multilingual turn emphasized that this wasn't the case, that it wasn't a question of developing two separate systems, developing monolingual competence in two separate systems, but rather of developing a multilingual competence where the competence in one language was embedded in the competence of another language, etc. And people started to talk about multiple competencies in bilingual, multilingual learners, and started also to emphasize that it wasn't just the L1 that influenced the L2, but also that the L2 could influence the L1. And then we come to the term translanguaging and the idea that in the multilingual turn, we find situations where language learners frequently move from one language to another within a single interaction. And this particular development was very transdisciplinary. It drew on cognitive, psychological, social theories, etc. Now, before I move on to the second question that I want to talk about, I thought that it would be helpful if I just referred to this particular article. Sorry, I'm trying to move this. This was an article published by Zhang in Studies in Second Language Acquisition in 2019. And he used bibliometric analytical techniques to try to see to what extent there were differences in what SLA researchers were researching in two periods, 1997 to 2007, 2008 to 2018. So you can see that in 1997 to 2007, some of the key constructs were a focus on communicative and interactive aspects of second language acquisition, a focus on form and social SLA. And 2008 to 2018, he said the communicative interactive focus had shrunk, social SLA had grown, so had social cultural SLA, and individual differences began to play a major role in researchers' work. Finally, interestingly, there was a huge growth in the interest in how people acquired vocabulary in a second language. Much of the earlier research had focused on grammar and to a certain extent pragmatics. What we are now seeing is a much stronger focus on vocabulary. So these are some generalizations, which I'll go through very quickly. Clearly, old aspects get revisited in new ways. And when they do that, they tend to draw on new theoretical perspectives. Clearly, SLA has become increasingly transdisciplinary, drawing on different disciplines. And you could argue that it has become much more fragmented. Theories have multiplied. Some theories have lost followers over the years. I think Krashen's monitor model is not now recognized as an adequate explanation for how people acquire a language, but many have survived, such as Long's interaction hypothesis. There are multiple theories and there are tensions among SLA researchers about these multiple theories. Clearly, where we are now is that differences exist regarding the overall orientation of SLA, with some researchers clinging to a purely cognitive view of second language acquisition. Long and Doughty produced a handbook of second language acquisition in 2003, and they adopted a purely cognitive view. They really refused to take account of the interest in social theories of second language acquisition. Not all researchers have been interested in pedagogical applications, and not all theories, in my opinion, universal grammar being one, have much to say to teachers. So let me quickly now go through my second research question. How have researchers investigated second language acquisition? I think the first thing we need to recognize is that, like many areas of inquiry, second language acquisition is now very versatile in the methods that it uses. Just as there's been changes in the focus of SLA and changes in the disciplines that SLA draws on, so increasingly new methodological approaches have been introduced. There's a good book by Mackey and Gass that gives an up-to-date account of second language research methods. The fundamental distinction is the distinction between etic and emic. And what I've done here is to just identify the methods that have been used from an etic perspective, where the focus is on observing and assessing learners' second language behavior, and the emic perspective, where the focus is on learners' subjective understandings of their own behavior. And obviously, I don't have time to explain all these differences, but I think you can see a very clear dichotomy here between the methods that are associated with etic inquiry and the methods associated with emic inquiry. I think another important distinction in looking at the methodology of SLA is what researchers focused on. And typically, researchers have focused on groups, but increasingly, they've also begun to focus more on individuals. And again, you can see that the research that's focused on groups has a number of clear characteristics, and similarly with the research that's focused on individuals. The third point I want to point out about the methodology of SLA is the importance in considering the types of data that researchers were investigating. And I focus here on three basic types of data: naturally occurring second language use, experimentally elicited L2 use, that is to say, an attempt to elicit fairly natural use, but to do it experimentally using tasks, and finally tests, clinically elicited L2 use. Why is this important? Because I think that the findings that you get when you look at data that comes from naturally occurring language use, experimentally elicited L2 use, and in particular, clinically elicited L2 use can be very different. That the type of data that you collect is going to lead to findings about that particular data, but not necessarily findings that will generalize to other types of data. My final comment about methodology is that there has been increasing methodological sophistication. I've given you one last picture here. You know who this is? And his name has momentarily escaped me, but it will come back. And I think what we are seeing is that SLA research has become increasingly methodologically sophisticated. The early studies were, I think, methodologically quite simple in another ways. But more recently, there is a demand that for greater rigor in research. I'll draw attention in particular to meta-analysis. Meta-analysis really made an appearance in the beginning of this particular century with an article by Norris and Ortega when they analyzed all the studies that had investigated form-focused research. The idea of meta-analysis is to analyze a whole bunch of studies and to see whether it's possible, therefore, to come to some general conclusions as a result of looking at all these studies. It's a statistical process. This was my third question, which is why on earth should we investigate second language acquisition? And in order to answer this question, what I did was to look at a number of survey books of second language acquisition, starting with my own book, Ellis, 1985, Long and Larson Freeman's book, Mitchell and Miles' book, which has gone through many revisions, many new editions, Doughty and Long's Handbook of Second Language Acquisition, and Ortega's General Survey of Second Language Acquisition. All of these books offer the reader a reason for investigating second language acquisition. I think that by looking at these books, we can end up with four main reasons for why people look at second language acquisition. It's important to recognize, though, that different researchers will focus on a different reason. It can help to guide language teaching. I would say that this is my overriding reason for investigating second language acquisition. Its contribution to social practice, for example, informing policymaking about immigrant populations. It can assist the development of its parents' discipline by serving as a testing ground for linguistic, cognitive, and social theories. So in that respect, SLA becomes a kind of parasitic on these other areas. It simply serves as a means of investigating theories that exist in other disciplines. And fourthly, which I think also played a role in my own approach to SLA, pure academic curiosity. So I want now to point out that there are clearly different underlying conceptualizations about what SLA is. And I think where we are now is a divide between two views about SLA. First of all, it's a sub-branch of applied linguistics, and therefore essentially problem solving. In other words, SLA is not really a discipline in its own right. It's part of applied linguistics, and the essential feature of applied linguistics is that it attempts to deal with real-life problems. So in the case of SLA, perhaps the real-life problem that it's tried to grapple with above others is how to teach, how to ensure that we teach a language effectively. And then the other conceptualization is that SLA is an independent discipline. It's got ties to other academic disciplines. It draws on other academic disciplines, linguistics and cognitive psychology, for example, but it's separate from them. So I think we've got these two very different views as to what SLA is. I'm moving now towards some conclusions to my talk. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Thomas Kuhn and his views about the evolution of theories. He suggested that as a discipline matures, a paradigm emerges that sets limits on the domain of inquiry. In other words, initially, when a new discipline appears, when a new area of inquiry appears, it tends to suck in ideas from a whole range of areas. But over time, it settles on what is the actual domain of inquiry. Has this happened in SLA? I don't think it has happened. And I'm not sure that actually, I agree with Kuhn. I'm not sure that it really happens in any discipline or in particular, any discipline in the social sciences. De Keyser focused on the bifurcation in SLA that arose within the social turn. Remember, the social turn appeared at the end of the 1990s and then grew and grew and grew in our present situation. And I have here a quotation from him. He found this worrisome for those such as himself who have a vested interest in SLA, because if this trend continues, SLA will be absorbed completely into psycholinguistics or cognitive psychology on the one hand, and anthropology or sociology on the other hand. So he found that when this bifurcation occurs, it threatens the identity of SLA as a discipline in its own right. I want now to turn to the idea of whether SLA can be considered a discipline in its own right. And I'm drawing here on a book by Krishnan, who identified a number of characteristics that a discipline must have in order to really be considered to be a discipline. And these are the characteristics that you can see. And these are my comments in the right-hand column. You can see my comments. So he said, first of all, there's a particular object of research. And I think that, yes, SLA does have a clearly identified particular object of research. Secondly, there's an accumulated specialized knowledge referring to the object of research, not generally shared with another discipline. And here I point out that SLA has drawn on knowledge from different disciplines, established disciplines, and it's adapted the specialized knowledge to explain and account for second language acquisition. So you could argue that this too points to the fact that it is a separate discipline. There are theories and concepts that can organize the accumulative knowledge effectively. I think this is where there is a problem, because there are multiple theories in second language acquisition, and it's not clear whether we're moving towards some kind of unified theory that might enable to incorporate all the different perspectives. So from that perspective, maybe SLA is not yet arrived at becoming a discipline. There are specific terminologies referring to the object of research. There's a wealth of special terminology, but there's really no agreed set of common core terms. So this again suggests that there's a way to go before SLA is a discipline. Specific research methods have been developed, yes. I'm going to try to move this up. Okay. Yes, SLA has largely borrowed its research methodologies from other disciplines, but it's applied them in creative ways. So I think we get a rather mixed picture here. Another of Krishnan's criteria was that in order to be recognized as a discipline, it must have a clearly identified place in academia. And it's there where I feel that SLA cannot really claim to be a discipline. There are relatively few universities who basically offer, who really have a department of second language acquisition. By and large, SLA is found in a whole range of other different departments, such as applied linguistics, such as psychology, such as sociology, etc. This is from Holstein, another person who's had a huge influence on me. And he suggested that there are, in fact, two types of discipline linked to two types of theory. He says there are disciplines that address fundamental issues, such as the existence of linguistic universals and how language has evolved in the human species. And this leads to theories that can be reliably tested. And he suggested that Long's interaction hypothesis is one type of theory. And then he suggested that there are other types of disciplines that address issues of an applied, mainly educational nature. He said that these theories that support this are pre-scientific, and he gave Krashen's monitor model as an example. And I think what we can take from this is that SLA is a bit of a mishmash. That yes, it does address fundamental issues, and yes, it does draw on theories that are testable, but equally, particularly if we view SLA as an applied discipline, then it draws on theories that are perhaps not easily testable. And this is my last slide. This is my own view. If we accept that SLA is fundamentally an applied area of inquiry, diversity is no longer a problem, and there will be no need for turf battles over boundaries of SLA, because this is what we currently have. In other words, if it's an applied area, if we go back to my previous slide, it doesn't matter that we've got sort of a mishmash of theories and pre-scientific theories, if in fact these theories can usefully inform the problems that we are using SLA to try to solve. But I would add, in other words, I tend to take the view that if SLA is a discipline, it's not a pure discipline, it's an applied discipline. But I would add one thing, and this is my reservation about the social turn. The social turn has led to researchers conflating learning with language use. That basically theories of the social turn tend to be theories of second language use. But I do not think that you can really claim that you're doing second language acquisition unless you show the connection between second language use and learning. I think if you're focusing just on second language use, you're not really doing SLA. You're really doing sociology or anthropology. Well, thank you for listening. I hope that you have found my survey of second language acquisition, some of the controversies that currently exist in it, and the uncertainties that exist as to what SLA is. Is it a pure discipline? Is it an applied discipline? Is it really not a discipline at all? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ellis. We already have several comments and questions, and I'm going to start with the first one that was actually proposed by Kim Noos. Where is motivation in the development of the SLA field? And in your opinion, where does it fit in a theory of SLA. And she also asks you whether you're going to publish an article or a book summarizing your talk. And if not, she suggests you do that.
Well, thank you very much for that question. Let me first of all say that actually the article on which this talk is based is already published. It was published in the journal Language Teaching, a Cambridge University Press journal, and I think it was last year, 2020. So if you go and look at the copies of Language Teaching, you should be able to find it there. To turn now to your question, what is the place of motivation? Well, I think the first thing is to say that theories of motivation and investigating the motivation of language learning has really run concurrently with all the different phases that I have been describing. But when the initial studies of motivation by people like Lambert and Gardner were not really closely associated with the early development of second language acquisition. They really occurred somewhat separately, right? And they were focusing in particular on bilingual societies such as Canada to try to understand what factors influenced the success of, say, Anglophones developing French or Francophones developing English. Over time, however, motivation has become quite a central theme in second language acquisition. For a while, it was very separate from the work that was being done on, say, the sequence and order of acquisition or the testing of linguistic hypotheses, etc. So it wasn't really perhaps until the third stage that we began to see motivation playing a role. It became much more influential in the social turn phase because obviously the extent to which learners are motivated is heavily influenced by their agency and their social identity. And so motivation became a major topic of inquiry. And I should here, of course, mention one very big name in motivation, which is Zoltan Dornier. Interestingly, if you look at Dornier's work, the theoretical perspectives that he has drawn on have kind of changed every 10 years, influenced by other developments in second language acquisition. So more recently, he has tended to try to research and theorize motivation in terms of dynamic systems theory, complex dynamic systems theory. So we do see that motivation is being increasingly sucked in to the developments that occurred in SLA. It started off separate, but has increasingly become embedded and seen as an essential element in SLA.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. So since you mentioned the complex system theory, I'm going to ask you a question proposed by Luciani Sturm. Quote, considering your 4 main reasons to research SLA, how do you think the complex DS theory can help teachers' pedagogy?
That's a very good question. I think I need to be pretty honest here. I am not a supporter of complex dynamic systems theory, particularly given my applied perspective, my belief that the real value of SLA is in problem solving, including language pedagogy. So I'm not a supporter of it. I need to tell a little story here. Kees de Bot is one of the big names associated with dynamic systems theory. And I was once interviewed by Keyes for a book that he was writing. And I took the opportunity to ask him a question while I was being interviewed. And my question was, do you think that complex systems theory can really be considered a theory? And he paused a bit and said, he said, maybe it's better considered a metaphor. Right? Of course, that raises a question, a metaphor of what? And we didn't delve into that, in fact. Why do I think it is not particularly relevant to language pedagogy? Because one of the essential claims of dynamic systems theory is that you cannot make predictions about how learners learn. You can only describe what learners do when you've investigated what they do. You cannot predict what they do. You can only describe what you find they do, right? Now, if SLA is to have any real value for language pedagogy, surely we need to be able to make some kind of predictions about what particular learning behaviors are likely to facilitate, foster the successful development of a second language. And if you can't do this, then it seems to me that dynamic systems theory, whether it's a metaphor or whether it is a theory, doesn't really have anything to offer language teaching.
Okay,
I would make one other comment about, dynamic systems theory. And at the end of my talk, I mentioned that to me, it seems to me that that SLA must be concerned with how people acquire a language. And I think a lot of work on dynamic systems theory doesn't focus on how learners acquire a language. It focuses on language use. And I think that theories that focus just on language use are not really applicable to second language acquisition.
Thank you.
One last comment. Sorry.
No problem.
And that is that I have to admit that there will be a lot of SLA people out there who will strongly disagree with what I just said. But there are others who will probably strongly agree.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Natalia Pinheiro. Quote, considering that many studies on SLA have proficiency as an independent variable, what should researchers consider when choosing the instrument that will measure participants' L2 proficiency?
Not sure I completely understand that question. So do you want to repeat the first part of it again?
Sure. Considering that many studies on Ellis on SLA have proficiency as an independent variable, what should researchers consider when choosing the instrument that will measure participants' L2 proficiency? Oh,
well, this is a really big question. And it takes us into what proficiency is, right? To my mind, this is my view, to my mind, in order to understand proficiency from an SLA perspective, we need to accept the fundamental distinction between implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. Implicit knowledge is that kind of knowledge that is not conscious and is available for rapid automatic language use. And explicit knowledge is that knowledge that is conscious or can be made conscious and is typically not available for automatic language use. So if we take this distinction, we can now ask, how do we need to measure proficiency in SLA studies? And the answer is that we probably need to obtain measures of both proficiency as implicit knowledge and proficiency as explicit knowledge. And there are different tools for trying to achieve that. In fact, some of my own research has focused on the development of tests that can provide relatively separate measures of implicit and explicit knowledge. I'm currently involved in a project investigating how we can develop tests to measure implicit and explicit knowledge of pragmatics, not just grammar, but of pragmatics. So that's my answer to that question. There's no one test that we can use. Probably, given that implicit knowledge is considered to be more fundamental than explicit knowledge, if it is a question of only looking at one type of knowledge, then we ought to look at proficiency as implicit knowledge.
There's a question related to proficiency posed by Annie Loyne. What is your view of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages or other such frameworks of communicative language competence and use? Would you like me to?
Are you able to put that question up so I can see it?
It's on the chat box on our chat here. The last one. What is your view of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages or other such frameworks of communicative language competence and use?
The Common European Framework, first of all, the Common European Framework has been enormously influential, right? And it is not really being developed by second language acquisition researchers. It is being developed by applied linguists from different branches of applied linguists, and in particular by people with good and rich understanding of language pedagogy, right? So the descriptors that you find in the framework are not descriptors that really correspond to what we know about how learners acquire a second language. They are can-do statements that describe what learners need to do, and there is an attempt to put them into levels with the assumption that those that occur at the early level, A1, are going to be much easier to master than those that occur at later levels, right? There has been some research that has attempted to relate the framework and the descriptors in the framework to what we know about second language acquisition, to see, in fact, if you like, whether those different levels do clearly correspond to what we can identify as acquisitional levels. But it is important to recognize that those levels are not acquisitional levels. I don't think, from what I know, although I haven't followed this research in detail, I don't think that there has been a lot of success in trying to meld the work that went into the common framework with SLA.
Okay, another question that has to do with the second part of your talk, like where we're going to. A question posed by Maria Lima. Dr. Ellis, today we're entering the universe of artificial intelligences, and research is becoming more and more technological. In your opinion, what is still unexplained by SLA theories?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer because different theories have really tried to explain different aspects of second language acquisition. And I think that I can't produce a general answer to it. I'd have to look at a particular theory and say, what does it currently not explain, right? So if you take perhaps one of the most influential theories, like the interaction hypothesis, Michael Long's interaction hypothesis, I think that there are issues that are still unclear about it. as he initially framed this, he linked the interaction hypothesis to the idea of the negotiation of meaning, where there was communication breakdown, and through the process of dealing with the breakdown, learners' attention would be drawn to new particular features, etc. Right? And Michael Long has always emphasized that for acquisition to take place, learners have to be primarily focused on meaning. But once one starts to look at a lot of the research, including some of my own research and research done in classrooms, you will find that, in fact, a lot of the negotiation that takes place is not really negotiation of meaning, that there's not a lot of communication breakdown that actually happens in a lot of classrooms, right? But negotiation does happen, but it's negotiation of form. That is to say, teachers make the effort to use recasts and other ways of correcting learners, even though they've understood them, purely with an idea of drawing attention to particular linguistic forms, right? So here we have the interaction hypothesis, and what does it cover? Does it just cover negotiation of meaning? Does it cover negotiation of form? And perhaps quite crucially, which of these two types of negotiation, meaning and form, is most crucial for second language acquisition, and which is most important for trying to explain the role of interaction in classroom language learning? So there are, even though this theory has been enormously influential and has promoted enormous amounts of research, there are still issues that have not really been resolved. And I think you could probably start to do the same with just about any particular theory. Let me take another example. Sociocultural theory argues that learning commences on the outside. It's an external phenomenon that occurs when learners interact, and through interaction, they come to be able to say something that they could not say before, that they did not know and they could not say before. And then there is a process that occurs whereby what they have been able to do externally becomes internalized so that eventually they can use it independently. But when I look at the sociocultural theory, I don't really find any really convincing explanation of this process of moving from external use, the initial learning of something, to independent use when it's internalized. It seems to me that sociocultural theory does not really fully account for this process of internalization. And having said that, I know that there will be social culturalists who are probably listening in who will strongly disagree with what I've said. So yeah, perhaps my concluding comment to this is, where are we? Controversy, different views, different opinions. This is what SLA is. It is not an agreed, accepted body of findings.
So let me pose a question by, sorry if I am mispronouncing your name, but Lawrence Comajon. How does the discipline of ISLA, instructed SLA, fit in within SLA versus language teaching debate?
Well, first of all, as I tried to say in my talk, I think that it is not clear that SLA is a discipline in its own right. And if it is, I've argued that it's best viewed as an applied discipline, right? Not a pure discipline. Secondly, I think it's a mistake to sort of separate out one area of SLA and then sort of label it as a separate discipline. So instructed second language acquisition, ISLA, in your question, was presented to me as a discipline, which I don't think it is. I think that instructed second language acquisition is one element in the wider applied discipline of SLA. I'm not sure I completely answered the question because I was disputing the premise, right?
Okay.
Do you want to repeat the last part of the question so I can see?
Oh, the last part was, so instructed SLA, where, how does this instructed SLA fit into SLA versus language teaching?
Oh, well, instructed SLA is part of SLA. That's what I just said, right? And it is one part of SLA, one element of SLA, if you like, that is clearly of high relevance to language pedagogy, right? But it is not language pedagogy. It is a body of research and theoretical information about the role that instruction plays in second language acquisition. And so, like SLA in general, there needs to be a process by which we take the findings of instructed second language acquisition and think about how they can be applied to language pedagogy. There's a process of moving from the information, research, theory that is part of instructed second language acquisition to applications. And I think this is something also that really needs a lot of thought, and people have written about, including myself in several articles over the years. What is the relationship between what the research shows us in SLA and language pedagogy? And one of my own developments is to suggest that perhaps we need to move away from that way of thinking about the relationship between SLA and language pedagogy, right? Where we talk about applying SLA to language pedagogy. And that's why I mentioned my book with Natsuko Shintani, which reflects very much my current view. Let us start with language pedagogy. Let us start with what teachers do. Let us start with what very experienced teacher educators are telling teachers to do. And let's evaluate their proposals, their guidance, their suggestions by what we know about second language acquisition, right? So the starting point is not SLA, the starting point is pedagogy and our understanding of pedagogy, and then using SLA to question and give support to what is currently considered to be good pedagogy. It reverses the whole relationship between pedagogy and SLA, not SLA applied to pedagogy, but pedagogy which can be examined and evaluated in terms of SLA.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Now a question, actually 3 different people asked a very similar question. Viviane Furtoso asks, Dr. Ellis talks about the concepts of bilingualism and multilingualism. What about plurilingualism? Are multi and pluri referring to different concepts? And then Alex compliments, he says, while this talk focused mainly on L2, does the content apply to L3 and beyond? And Fa Palma also asks about plurilingualism.
I'm not sure that multilingualism, bilingualism, plurilingualism, I mean, I think these are interlocking terms. Bilingualism obviously refers to the idea of 2 languages. Multilingualism refers to the idea of 2 or more languages. And plurilingualism, it would seem to me, refers to the same thing, in fact. So I personally don't think I mean, when you have these terms, you can probably always define them in ways that will make subtle differences, but I'm not sure I would want to, right? Okay, sorry, what's the second part now? Having dealt with...
Whether the content that you presented could be applied to L3, a third acquired language and not a second? Or beyond, I'm sorry.
Yes. I mean, that I think is an important issue. By and large, the term L2 has not just meant second language. It's meant second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth language, right? It's been used as a cover term to refer to another language. In some ways of writing about this, people have tended to prefer the term additional language to L2, right? Can the findings of SLA be applied beyond the idea of just a second language? I would think quite clearly so. I would think I think that there is clear evidence that the regularities that we see in second language acquisition, you find in third language acquisition, you find in fourth language acquisition. There are some differences, however, and some of the differences have attracted research, one of which is the notion of transfer. Because if you're looking at a person who knows 3 languages, for example, there is the possibility of transfer not just from their so-called mother tongue to the second language they learned, but the possibility of transfer from the second language they learned to the second language. So there's transfer from L2 to L3, if you like. And there has been research that's investigated that. So yeah, there are going to be differences. And again, if you take Vivian Cook's powerful idea of multi-competencies, he would argue that every time you learn a second language, you are not just adding new linguistic knowledge to your resources, but inevitably you're modifying the resources of the language that you already know. That we need to accept that that languages in the human brain are hugely interconnected and will influence each other in a number of different ways. But I think we're a long way from being able to pinpoint the nature of those interconnections. I mean, multi-competence is a powerful idea, but how do we actually work it out in terms of what actually happens? What predictions can we make on the basis of a theory like multi-competence? Not sure.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Dr. Ali Shehadeh posed a question to you that says, where would you place your own great contributions to SLA research?
Academics like me, researchers like me, perhaps come in 2 kinds. There are what you might call the compilers, the people who compile knowledge and classify it. And there are the people who seek to originate knowledge, right? And I think I'm both. I think if you look at my research, I have been obviously a compiler. Think of those huge, big, long study of second language acquisition books, right? But equally, if you look at my published articles, I've been an originator as well. My 2005 article, which published the results of my research into developing separate tests of implicit and explicit knowledge, has been very influential and followed up in a number of different ways. So that was an original piece of research. But I suppose most people will look at me as a compiler, right? Which slightly annoys me, because once they see you as a compiler rather than an originator, you get positioned. And I would really kind of like to dispute that I be positioned purely as a compiler. Of course, my talk today is the talk of a compiler.
Okay.
Perhaps one more question.
There are more questions and comments and lots of thank notes. You can see all of them. Do we have time to one more?
We can do one more question.
Okay, so let me ask Pietra Casol Rigati's question. Actually, she asks two questions, but they are about the same. I'm going to read both of them, but so Professor, what innovations would you expect to see in the future of SLA? What new approaches?
Let me answer that.
Yes.
Let me answer that. I think what we're going to see is increasing neurolinguistic research. This has already started, but in some ways, I think a lot of it is unsatisfactory because the kinds of tasks that they give language learners to do in order to investigate what goes on in their brain when they're doing the task are very artificial type tasks. It goes back to the point I made about 3 types of data, and the type of data that is typically collected in neurolinguistic studies is the 3rd type, elicited use of language, right? Rather than natural use of language. So, but I think undoubtedly we're going to see more and more neurolinguistic studies. We really want to know what is the mind doing with the input that it receives? What is the mind doing when it's required to produce output in a second language?
So there are other questions, but we can send them to you. And if you'd like, you can answer, and somehow we can publish your answers. We'd like to thank you so much to be part of Abralinha ao Vivo. We'd like to thank all viewers, more than 130 people online, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you so much for all the participation. Thank you for your contributions. Dr. Ellis, would you like to say a few final words?
Well, I've said so many, I'm not so sure that I really can say any more. I think the best thing I can say is just, again, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And I hope to see you all in Abralinha ao Vivo soon. Thank you. And be a member of Abralinha, okay?
Okay, so I'm going to say bye-bye and leave you now. And thank you for your help with the questions and introducing me.
Thank you, Professor Ellis.